Hey, shall we start, Deepa? Are you good with it? All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nitin. I'm a member of the Reporters Collective. Some of you may be aware of what Reporters Collective is. For others, we're a small group of like-minded journalists who carry out what might be called investigative work or deep dive journalism that looks at different parts of the political economy. Um, But also part of the mandate is to not just the few of us keep doing things together, but to try and help other journalists who want to do similar work, who also gain the skills that are possible. Um, we're about 5 years old, and this is one of our first workshops that we're starting to get to understand different issues. The budget is particularly important for most of us because it helps us understand the nature of governance. It affects our own lives in many ways, sometimes in ways that we don't understand right off. But in the longer sense, it sends signals to the economy of where the government is going and where it wants our lives, our industries, our people who work, and the health and welfare of our people, how they see it changing. Um, to help us parse through what government documents look like and what we can understand as basics from them, as well as how to sometimes understand what governments are trying to tell us in a different way than we can see the first go. We have Dr. Dipa Sinha with us. She's an assistant professor at the Ambedkar University. But the reason we thought of her as somebody who can help us go through those documents is she's helped unbelievable number of journalists over the last decade understand these things at the last moment or a day after the budget comes out. I have personally gained a lot from her understanding, and she's been very kind in helping journalists understand things, not typically like an expert will give a quote, but she'll actually help you run through documents and understand things. Much of my understanding of the budget has come from Deepa and some others like her who've been very kind to journalists, sometimes at the test of their own patience. Without much ado, I'll leave it up to Deepa to guide us through this. And many of you sent questions earlier. We'll take the questions at the end of the session. If anyone has any questions, as Deepa suggested, maybe we'll get a question with something is not clear. Put it in the chat box and we'll go back to them at the end of the conversation. So keep putting your questions in the chat box and moderate, and I'll put out questions that Deepa can respond to much later. Right, Deepa, handing over to you.
Thank you, Nitin, for the kind introduction. And I'm hoping that, this session is really basic. We just have about 2 hours in which I plan to speak for about a little more than an hour so that we have time for questions and discussions. So it's quite basic, and there are a number of you who have been covering these issues for many years. So a lot of it is stuff that you would know, and feel free to add later, correct me in any way. But it's mainly targeted at the fresher, younger lot because we saw that the registrations are also largely from them, but also because often that we are engaged with the budget mostly on the day that the budget comes out, and we don't really have time to then go and look back for definitions and things that we need to know when we start opening those documents and looking at those numbers. So broadly, in two halves, the first I'll just go through the main terms that the budget uses, what it means, where we can find documents and so on. Towards the latter part, I thought I will give some examples of things which are they're not always what you see in first sight, and we have to dig a little deeper to know what the truth is before reporting or understanding them better. Um, to begin with, what is a budget? Like many say, and it is an accounting statement. It's a statement of receipts and expenditures of the government for a particular year. So, like every organization has their budget, households often have their budgets. The government also has its budget. So, one view is that it's just an accounting statement and it's given much more importance than it is. That government is making policy throughout the year and it's constantly changing. So the kind of attention that the budget is given is probably unwarranted, is what many would argue. But on the other hand, I think beyond being a statement of just government finances, the way the budget plays out, while it is true that it is this accounting statement, it's also an occasion where in the democratic process, we see it is a statement of intent. So the budget speech is often a political speech. It is not just being presented as an accounting statement, but it is telling us what the intent of the government is. And in more recent years, when you look at it, it's also not just about the current financial year. The recent budgets have been kind of giving us signals about more longer term agendas, like the Amrit Kal. First time we heard of it was in the budget speech last year, and that's an agenda up to 2047. So it was a 25-year sort of plan. Or certain statements like, again, the budget speech last year, the finance minister spent time saying that they're expanding capital expenditure as a form of expanding demand to create employment and so on. So these are kind of statements and issues which we don't, it's not everything related to that speech is contained in the budget, but it gives us a signal for how the government is thinking and what it might be doing, and also how the government is understanding the current state of the economy. So this year is an interim budget, so it won't happen right now, but every year, one day before the budget, the government also releases the economic survey, which kind of primes us for the budget, because that tells us what it's thinking about the state of the economy, and the next morning we hear their response to that. And it's like I'll say later also, it's useful to look at these documents together. So basically that the interest in budget is not just for the accounting, but also for the political economy and the statements of intent that are hidden in them, often where we don't get to hear them as general public through any other forum. There are many parliamentary committees. There's a long process that goes towards the formation of the budget, but those are not happening as transparently. So this becomes one occasion when everybody live in real time sort of knows what's happening. So before getting into those kind of issues, I'm just using the budget has something called a budget at a glance statement, which is just one page. I'm just using that initially to lay out some of the key terms that we need to know when we are looking at the budget or presenting the figures in it. Like I said, I'm not going into all the terms that are used in the budget. That could be a whole course, and even I'm not an expert in all of it. Also, many of the line items and heads keep changing year on year. That's one of the things we need to be careful about, and therefore nobody is an expert. Each time there will be a surprise. I think the objective today is to know that these things happen and that we need to look for it, but it's difficult to predict where and what will be. Sometimes even those of us who've been working on budgets for many years discover things only as we keep digging in many, many days after the budget has actually come out. And there is no single course which can tell us. It's, I think, only people who work in the government really know what go into it. But therefore, all of us know parts of the budget better than other parts, the parts that we use. So in my case, I know the expenditure part better than the receipts, because that's what I started working on. In any case, we look at, so the first term that you see in any table, figure on what allocations have been made, or when it's been comparing with previous years, we see these three terms, which is budget estimate, revised estimate, and actuals. So budget estimate is basically what is being budgeted, what the government is planning to spend, or what it thinks it will earn in the coming year. That is something that is made on the day of the budget. So it's before, a priori, before it has happened, what you think you will spend or what you think you will receive. Revised estimate is where after about 6 months, depending on how much has been spent or what has received, all these estimates are revised. This is when the supplementary demand for grants are also taken into consideration. So the budget gives you the revised estimates of the previous year. So this budget at a glance is of the 23-24 budget, which tells us 22-23 revised estimates. So what it basically tells us is in 22-23, when the year began, what the government planned to do, and after mid-year, what is the progress based on which, how are they revising it? So usually if you're, for example, trying to look at expenditures, at allocations for something like, say, health or nutrition or ICDS, the revised estimates are often very useful because if the government is overspending somewhere else, usually these are the areas where they cut. And we get to know that through the revised estimates, where we see that although X amount of rupees was planned to be spent, not even half of that has been spent, and the revised estimate has therefore been reduced. So it's important to look at the revised estimate as well. The actuals, on the other hand, are after the audit is complete, and that is a longer process. So you get the actuals only for the completed financial year. So for instance, right now, if February 1st, 2024 is when the budget is being presented, 23-24 is still ongoing. So we will get the actuals for 22-23 now. So that's a little older, but again, we can look at the older budget documents and see what was budgeted and what was actually finally spent, or what was budgeted to be received and what was actually received. So these are the three terms that you have to look at. And therefore, when reporting in a paper, I mean, as a journalist or a researcher, it's important to also say which is being used. So some say the good practice is to compare like with like. So to compare budget estimate with budget estimate. On the other hand, some would argue that for certain things, revised makes more sense because that is what is really happening. I would say either is okay as long as one is transparent about which one is looking at, and it also depends on what one is trying to say. There are two main components in the budget. There's the receipts budget and the expenditure budget. Like we said, it's an account statement of what the government is earning and what the government is spending. And both of these, receipts as well as expenditure, are further broken down into revenue and capital. So you have within the receipts budget, you have a revenue budget and a capital budget. And within expenditure, again, you have revenue and capital. Broadly speaking, we use the term revenue to indicate what is current or recurring. So in the case of expenditure, it would be things like salaries, spending on goods, which every month you have to do, rent, the petrol, so on, for the government vehicles and so on. Whereas capital expenditure is anything that creates assets. Similarly, in terms of the receipts budget, it would be if it is increasing liabilities or reducing. So capital is related to a longer term, where you're getting returns from it later, or you have taken a loan. Revenue is to do with the current period. So within revenue receipts, all these slides are from the same table of the budget at a glance. They first tell you what the revenue receipts are. So revenue receipts, like I said, are current. So they are again broken up into two. You have the tax revenue and the non-tax revenue. Tax revenue includes both direct and indirect. So it includes your income tax, your corporation tax, your GST, customs, and so on. Again, those breakup is available. Non-tax revenue is revenue from other sources that the government earns from the non-tax sources. And then you have the capital receipts, which is to do with the recovery of loans or any such capital receipts, borrowings, and other liabilities show up here. On total expenditures also divided by the revenue account and the capital account. And it's when you add those two, you get the total expenditure, which is this row 10 plus 13. In the revenue account, there's also interest payments as well as grant and aid for creation of capital assets. Again, it's a detail. This is technically a capital expenditure because it's being spent on capital assets, but it is going from the center to the state as grant and aid. So in the union budget, it comes under the revenue, but therefore you have an effective capital expenditure, which would be 12 plus 13. Based on these total receipts and total expenditure, you have different measures of deficit. Deficit is what the word really means. And this is one of the figures that media and everybody looks out for immediately after the budget speech, or even during the budget speech, on what the fiscal deficit is. What the deficit measures are basically telling us is what is the difference between how much the government is expecting to earn and what it is expecting to spend. and usually it is expecting to spend more than what it earns, and therefore there is a deficit. And even this deficit is defined differently. What the kind of deficit that we are usually most interested in is the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the difference between the total expenditure and the total receipts. Here, notice that this 1786816 figure is the same as fiscal deficit, which is basically the amount that the government is having to borrow because of the excess spending over the receipts. Right? So we remove that from the receipts, calculate the rest, and subtract that from the total expenditure, which is here, which will give you the fiscal deficit. The revenue deficit is basically looking at only the difference between the revenue expenditure and the revenue receipts. Why we look at this is again from the understanding that these are expenditure which are current, so you're not expecting any future returns from them. So usually, traditionally, mainstream understanding has been that a revenue deficit is what really needs to be contained. That is not really good because that is spending on consumables. That's not spending on something that is giving you returns later. All of this is debated, debatable by even macroeconomics principles, because one could argue how returns themselves are defined. For example, salaries to school teachers and doctors would come as revenue expenditure and might be contributing to the deficit, but they're also contributing to increasing the human capital and productivity in future. That doesn't get counted as contributing to the future in this accounting mechanism. In any case, the understanding behind that is this, that these are spending which don't have any tangible returns, and therefore revenue deficit is seen to be sort of more something that really needs to be contained. Overall, the fiscal deficit is what we look at as an indicator. Primary deficit is where it's the fiscal deficit minus interest payments on previous loans. Fiscal deficit also, again, just 2 minutes. There's, of course, a lot of debate, and this is basically, we are going into the domain of macroeconomics. But because fiscal deficit becomes such a big issue each time, why are we concerned about fiscal deficit? Once again, because it means that you are spending beyond your capacity. And one of the dangers of spending beyond your capacity is that there could be inflation in the economy. And inflation is something that is not good for the markets as well as people. I'm putting it in very, very simple sort of terms. But therefore, the markets are very sensitive about fiscal deficit, and the stock market usually responds to this. The rankings respond to it. But actually, in real terms, sometimes there is no hard and fast rule on so much is good or so much is for a certain amount is bad, although we do now have the FRBM Act, which kind of tells us what levels are acceptable and not. And like you'll see, it's reducing now, but it did increase as a response to COVID, as it did in India and across the world. So there are times when the state has to spend more than what it receives. I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that even the fiscal deficit is not just a number in a vacuum, but has to be understood in the current macroeconomic context. So there are times when fiscal deficit is something that is a tool that the government has to use to even revive the economy. There could be times when it is not really desirable to have that level of deficit, but you can't really say that without looking at what is going on in the economy. Given all this is again from the all the figures I'm showing are from the budget documents. They make some of these graphics as well to try and tell you what are the different budget lines that we just saw in this sort of format, which says that of the budget size, these are all the receipts where they're coming from. So tax revenue is much bigger than non-tax. And then this is where the spending is going, where they're looking at various different kinds of spending. Same thing, they also show it to you in the form of pie charts. I'm just showing this to say that within the budget documents itself, there is a lot of now training material available on the ways in which you can visualize the data that is there, how it can be simplified and how we can understand. So again, these pie charts also tell us that looks at the receipt budget, where does 1 rupee come from? What are the different sort of sources from which it comes? Income tax, GST, corporation tax, borrowings, and so on. And the spending, again, how much do we spend on centrally sponsored schemes? How much do we spend on pensions? What goes to the states as a share of taxes? This gives that kind of a broad breakup. So all of this comes in your budget at a glance document. All these documents are available on the India budget website. And I would recommend for those who are starting working on budgets to start with this key to budget document, which tells you what each of these things are. It's a brief description of everything that is there in the budget documents. This page gets populated about 10 minutes after the speech is completed. I think now they also have an app that you can download on your phone, which has all of this information in it. And on the day of the budget, none of us have the time to look at these things. So one, I would strongly recommend to, when you have the time, go through this key to budget document to know what are these different documents available, because each one of us might be interested in a certain part of it, and we'll know where it is available. Basically, the list from there is this. These are all the broad documents that are available in the budget, in the set of documents that the budget puts out. These that I've put in blue and green are the main documents which are mandated by law that have to be passed in the parliament. So I should have said this right at the beginning. By the constitution, the budget of the government has to be approved in the parliament, and it's only then that they can spend, which is why we also have this interim budget where you have a vote on account, where, because this is a outgoing government, they just take permission from the parliament for continuing regular spending for the next 3 months or 4 months until the next government is formed. The new government comes in and again presents a full budget, which will be debated and voted upon. So these three is something the parliament has to vote on. The green is under the FRBM, again, what they have to present in the parliament, and it has to be approved by the parliament. The other documents all come out of the annual financial statement, but they give you further detail in terms of what is there. And you have some other information that comes in, for example, an output monitoring framework, which is not it is not directly related to the budget, but it tells you in terms of programs, what is it that they're expecting to achieve, what outputs and what outcomes, to sort of justify the allocations that are making in the budget. Similarly, there is a document which tells you what are the major announcements of last year's budget and what were the achievements according to that. So I'll just show you the budget website. You should be able to see, this is what indiabudget.gov.in looks like. This is where you have the current budget. You could look at previous union budgets here. The day the budget is being presented, this will be sort of empty for some time till the speech is over, and then all these things will start coming in. These are the main documents which have the broad overview figures of things. I'll not open each of these, but this sort of tells you that there are these three funds that we have. The Consolidated Fund of India is where all the receipts go in, and all the spending is happening from the Consolidated Fund of India. There is a contingency fund, which is put aside for emergency expenditures, and expenditure from that can happen without parliamentary approval. The public account is it's an accounting mechanism where the funds are put in there first, and won't go into it very much. Like I said, you have this output outcome budget, which we can just look at the first example, which by ministry gives you what the output outcome is. So for example, in the agriculture department's budget, you'll find that some money has been allocated for the Kisan Samman Nidhi. This is telling us that this is the number of beneficiaries that they have enrolled, and that they hope to achieve all 100% target. But the interesting thing is that when you look at the implementation of announcements for the previous year, I mean, it would have been useful if it was done in the same format so that we could see that this is what they said they would do and have they done it. But that's not how it happens. This is a completely different way in which it is presented, which is related to some announcements in the speech or what they put in the key budget, and then they tell us some level of implementation. But it's still another source where if you want to, for example, if you see that the revised budget for a certain thing has reduced drastically, you might want to go here and see what are they saying about its implementation. Or it could have increased also. Then we can go here and check what the status of implementation is to try and understand what's going on. This right line is more useful in some ways. This budget at a glance, the first one is what I showed you screenshots of, but each of that, again, the deficit statistics, there are details of all that here. The expenditure profile again gives different things. There's some, this is where you'll also find your gender budget and child budget, which I'll show in just a little bit. Those who are working on particular sectors, this is what is useful. So for example, I work largely on the social sector. So if you just put this drop down, you see a list of all the ministries. So you can go to whichever ministry you are interested in. For example, let's say Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Health and Family Welfare has two departments. Department of Health and Family Welfare is the main one. And then you can download it. There you have these various schemes and budget heads along which expenditure happens. And if you notice, everything is given in this format. You will have the actuals for 2 years back. You'll have last year's budget, last year's revised budget, and what is being allocated this year. For instance, if you look at the overall headline figure, you see that there was a plan to spend 83,000 crores on health and family welfare last year. But by mid-year, looking at their spending trend, it's already come down to 76,000 crores. And then in the current year, they said they would increase it to 86,000. So this is where, again, sometimes, for instance, here the government would want to compare it with revised because they'll say they made a bigger increase. But to give a fuller story, I would say they last year also said they would spend a certain amount, and we can see that they're not going to do that. So I'm wary about this increase. It's a very small increase, and I don't even know if it will happen if you look at the trend. So, and if you look at 2 years back, 81,000, and compare that to the revised, then it seems actually that we will be spending less. So you have to look at all these four to try and make a story about what's happening. And then you have the various schemes that one looks at. In this, the only thing I'll say is that, of course, there are all these lines that you'll have to look at, is that you should also read this text at the end, which actually tells you what these heads mean. Because sometimes they have, and these names keep changing each year. So it's best to go down and look at these notes and see what they're saying. Every ministry, every department has this. It's not very difficult because nobody will be looking at every budget line. You might want to look at Ayushman Bharat. You might want to look at National Health Mission. But just go down. This is not very detailed explanation. And also some things like Swasthya Suraksha Yojana. There are so many yojanas. It's right there in that document where you can see what it is showing. So this drop down will give you all ministries, and it has budgets for everything. And sometimes, so for example, the budget for the COVID vaccine could be in the finance ministry's budget because because of the way in which it is getting passed to the states. So one needs to do a little bit of investigation when the numbers here are not matching what the speech has said, to try and find out why they're saying it. Usually they're not lying, but they are only presenting truth in not a straightforward manner. So one needs to investigate to see what they're doing. These same budgets are given in the form of demand for grants here. This is not very detailed, so it's not as useful. I'll open health only because that's what we just saw. So this gives it in the form of where it divides it between revenue and capital. It's the same thing. The totals would match, but it was presented in a different format. See, these final numbers are the same as what we just saw. What's more useful, for immediate analysis is what we just saw, which is the expenditure budget. So this is the expenditure side. Similarly, you have a lot of details for the receipt budget. So in the receipts, you have an abstract of receipts, which will give you things like how much is, so if you look at the abstract of receipts, for example, you can see tax revenue broken up into the different kinds of taxes. This is what is used to calculate what is the share of direct taxes in the total central taxes. So corporation and taxes on income would be direct taxes, the rest would be indirect taxes. You divide them up with the total, you'll get the share of direct taxes. So these are all the revenue receipts, the current receipts, and these are the capital receipts. So it gives a breakup. This is the simple overall abstract statement. If you go down to these, it will give further detail, and then again further detail in all of this. So as you can see, there are so many documents, and each of them have many technical terms, and one needs to really understand what they're all trying to say. And it's difficult to go through all of them, but broadly in everything, these things you will have, which is budget estimate, revised estimate, and actual expenditure, and you will have the revenue and capital accounts being shown. Some documents which are of interest, I thought I will share with you. One is the statement of revenue foregone, which became which is used quite often, and the format has changed. So we don't see that about 7-8 years back, we used to have these very big numbers about 5 lakh or 6 lakh crores being the revenue foregone. We don't see that, but we still see stuff here. So again, this is a lot of text, but it's not so much also. One should, if we are using it, we should read what it's saying. But basically, the idea behind revenue foregone is the revenue that the government could have got, but it is not getting because of various reasons. And some of them could be things which are good for the economy. Sometimes it can be even good for people from the poorer communities and middle class as well, because there are incentives that are being given. But many times, oftentimes, there are incentives that are being given for big corporates and higher profits. So the way they present it now, they've changed the name of the statement. It's been a few years since they've changed it, I think 2015. It's called Statement of Revenue Impact of Tax Incentives under the Central Tax System. There is no statement of revenue foregone anymore. This is what it is called. And it gives you by sector what the revenue foregone is. So for example, if you look at this, the revenue impact of incentives for corporate taxpayers, then they tell you, because of the various deductions that have been announced, how much revenue do they expect will be impacted because of these reductions. And you have a total. Similarly, if you keep going down, it will tell you because of customs, because of direct tax, various reasons what the revenue impact is. And you can add all that up if you want a total figure. The budget documents don't give you a total figure. But the first table itself, I think, is quite interesting, because it's not just the total numbers, it also tells you, like, for instance, this table is telling us what the effective tax rate is based on the profit size of the companies. And it's very telling to just look at this trend here, the last column, which is giving us the effective tax rate, which tells us that as the profit, the level of profit increases, actually the effective tax rate goes down. And it is the companies which have more than 500 crore profit, which are paying facing the lowest effective tax rate after all the deductions and incentives and so on. So there are certain broad headline things that we can find in these documents. And then, of course, one can go in and there could be difference of opinion on whether this should be the way it is or not. But this statement, although it doesn't give that one big number of revenue foregone like it did earlier, still has useful information in it. Then this, I think, after the recent Reporters Collective story, in Al Jazeera has become a document of interest, which is the statement of extra budgetary resources, which is basically telling us what is the amount. And as you can see, the recent years, it says that it's nil, that the government has stopped doing this. But the amount that the government is actually spending, but is not that they're not showing up in the budget. How does that happen? It happens when the government is spending on something, but it is I'll just show you data in relation to the food subsidy to explain how that happens. But basically, that it is taking, say, loans or borrowing from various sources, not through the budget, but through maybe a public sector enterprise, which is outside of government ministries and departments, and therefore it doesn't reflect in the budget. Now, why would governments do it? In my opinion, one of the reasons they would do it is also to where we started off, is to keep some control on that fiscal deficit figure. Because that figure itself, just because of the way markets work under the current macroeconomic framework that we are, it after a point it loses meaning. It's not really the actual deficit, but what one is looking at is only what is the fiscal deficit. It might well be the case that outside of the budget, the government has borrowed, say, 3 lakh crores. It was almost 4 lakh crores that were outstanding loans in the FCI, but that was not reflected in this. Had it been, then the fiscal deficit would have been actually almost a percentage point more of the GDP, and that would be difficult to handle. But this off budget kind of gives you various ministries now. And this was hailed as something that the government has done towards increasing transparency. So this is where you find it. It's under the expenditure profile in this part 4. It's called statement 27. But when you're looking at the website, you won't find statement 27. You'll have to look under expenditure profile. Similarly, revenue foregone is under the receipt budget in part A. When you go in the drop down, you'll find it. Like I said, there is also all these special groups where separately you look at, for instance, this is the gender budget, where each ministry is supposed to say from what they're spending, what is it that is going to women. And here you have 3 parts. You have part A, which is 100% women specific programs. So people would put something like this, the Central Institute for Women in Agriculture. Just directly, it's all women or girls hostels and so on. And then you have a part B, which is 30% women specific programs. So you have various development programs which women would also be benefited by, which are put here. The Narega also, for instance, will be there somewhere in this list. And these gives you totals. Again, from the totals, you can look at as a part, as a proportion of the total expenditure or the proportion of total GDP. How much is it that is being allocated in the name of women? And you can look at trends and so on. Similarly, you have a children budget. You also have a separate document for Northeastern region. You have allocation for welfare of SCs and STs. All these are there every year in the budget document. So if you look at the expenditure budget and go down the drop down list, you'll find all of these. And like I said, you also have the ministry wise, which I already showed you. This is the Women and Child Development Ministry, for instance. It will give you the various schemes. So for example, you have Samarthya here, where you have this Matruvandana, all these different schemes come under Samarthya, and it will tell you what the total allocations are. Like I said, this is very important again to see what is where, because for example, let's say the Saksham Anganwadi, names keep changing. So one year it was called, all the names are here, sort of. It used to be called ICDS, then it became Anganwadi Services, then it became Umbrella ICDS Services, then it became Saksham Anganwadi, and then it became Saksham Anganwadi and Poshan 2.0. So when we are comparing the budget across years, this is last year where things kind of settled a little bit in ICDS. But if you look at older budget documents, you'll see that there will be Saksham Anganwadi, which will have 000 for previous years. But it's not the case that Anganwadi is a new program. You will see somewhere else when you go up, it will say ICDS and you will have the data for the previous years. So to be able to compare that, you have to then go down and see which are comparable and what schemes come under each of these lines. So again, depending on what you're working on, you'll have to read this one page below the table to see what is going on and what can be compared and so on. So all of these are available here. If you keep looking at the expenditure profile, will give you all these gender budget, welfare for children, Northeast, everything is here. The other way to do it as a trick is to download the full. It will take a little bit of time to download, but the full is basically has everything that's there in all these statements. There you can use you can just do find and search for the term and find the statement. But there again, if you're lucky, you can. Sometimes it is a searchable PDF, sometimes it's not. Otherwise, if you know what you're specifically looking for, the list is here and you can just get those one-page summaries out. So now just moving on to, those are broadly the heads that we need to understand, the sources where you find the documents. I just made a list of things that as one has been analyzing the budget over the last decade or so, one has seen how things at face value sometimes have to be understood better in what are the figures that we really look at. So this is a list and I'll give examples for each of those. And it's of course difficult to predict what will happen in a future budget. It might be something new which is not in this list, or it might be something in this list but not the exact same scheme or ministry. But it's just broadly to give an idea that these are the kind of things to keep in mind. The first set is quite simple, which is that when we are assessing allocations over time, or when we are looking at what is the priority of the government, or how are we doing globally, for any comparison basically with other countries, with amongst different governments over time, one needs to first and foremost, like I've been saying, check for the change in names of schemes and changes in reporting. This is really important because we often see that things change or seem to change, but that's only because there is a change in name. Again, to give you the same ICDS example, earlier, like I was saying, the budget line was umbrella ICDS. So that covered only the budget which was going to the ICDS program. So the Anganwadi centers, their salaries, the food, and whatever expenses they were. Once that cord became Saksham Anganwadi, now you have one line, but that includes not just the umbrella ICDS, but it also includes certain other schemes to do with childcare services, etc. So if you're comparing previous years, one cannot compare umbrella ICDS with Saksham Anganwadi because umbrella ICDS is a subset of Saksham Anganwadi. And actually, one can't make a proper comparison because that breakup is no more available now. But one needs to still know that because otherwise it would seem as if the Anganwadi budget increased, which is not the case. It's just that other things also got subsumed under the line, which used to earlier have only Anganwadi. So one needs to look at these things quite carefully. Because even in the speech, sometimes these differences are not mentioned and they're presented as if an increase has happened when many times an increase has not happened. Other simple principles is especially again when we are looking at expenditures and when we are reporting increase or decrease in education or health or nutrition or any of these social sector expenditures or old age pensions, Narega, all of these is that real values make much more sense than nominal. So you might say that, for example, we saw the health budget, that if the health budget increases from 83,000 crores to 86,000 crores, in real terms, it means nothing if the inflation was, say, about 5-6%. So it always makes sense to check real versus nominal. One has to use some sort of an inflation, annual average inflation figure to deflate it. Usually RBI does a press release which gives you one, because if you look at the website where we have inflation data, And one can use that. That is better data, but that will give you monthly urban, rural, and so on. But even just looking at an RBI press release for what is the average expected inflation figure they have given, and just dividing it with that and seeing what the real value is, is something that should be done. And there is a lot of analysis now done by various organizations like, say, the Accountability Initiative or Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, which put out their reports also quite soon. And they put out a lot of material even in the run up to the budget, which make these kind of calculations and tell you, which have shown, for instance, that the real allocations for most social sector have actually reduced over the last 10-12 years. Similarly, other ways to look at it, especially if we are also comparing with, say, other countries or comparing states within India, is to look at the allocations as a share of the total expenditure or as a share of the GDP. So if we have been spending 60,000 crores on Narega, and if we continue to spend 60,000 crores every year, that doesn't mean that the spending has been maintained, because firstly, in real terms, the value is going down. Secondly, as our GDP is increasing, our spending capacity is also increasing. So if with increasing spending capacity, the allocations are not increasing, that tells us that the priority for that program is not keeping pace, or it's a program that's sort of dying down quietly, even though in just nominal terms, the number that you look at the budget, you might not see a fall. Again, we don't need to search very far for these things. There is a nominal GDP figure that the budget itself gives in that budget at a glance page. You just have to take the GDP figure from here, take the expenditure from the expenditure document, and divide the two to get them as the share of GDP. So, but any comparisons, it makes much more sense to do them as real or as shares. And just looking at nominal values are quite misleading, both in receipts and in expenditure. I'm giving examples from expenditure because that's what I'm much more familiar with. Similarly, I've said it 10 times, but repeat it again, that read the notes and understand the line items and the definitions. They are very, very important. I will give you the example of food subsidy because that's where there is a lot of confusion as well. So often we see in reporting, even in research papers, this confusion where it's assumed that the MSP that is given to farmers, the minimum support price, is a subsidy, while in fact it is not. A subsidy is something where the government is spending, say, less than the market. Is paying out for something for which it is not getting a market return. So when you are paying out the MSP, you are actually buying grain. So that is not a subsidy. It becomes a subsidy when that grain that you're buying is then again being sold at a much lower price or currently for free. I hope I'm making myself clear. It's very difficult in online to know if this is being communicated. I'll repeat it again. A subsidy is a subsidy in the case of food subsidy when the government is buying rice at, say, 30 rupees a kilo and is selling it at 3 rupees a kilo. So 30 minus 3, 27 rupees a kilo is a subsidy. The buying at 30 rupees is not a subsidy because you're buying rice. The government is also buying computers. The government is buying tables and chairs. Those are not called subsidy. This is also not subsidy. It is going to farmers. It is an MSP. You are buying in the market rice. That does not show anywhere in your budget. So how much the government is spending on procurement does not show. What shows as subsidy is how much is the government distributing in the PDS, and while doing so, what is the subsidy that it spent. So if I distributed 100, just for ease of the example, let's say I distributed 1,000 kilograms of wheat, and on each kg of wheat, the subsidy amount is 25, then 25,000 is the food subsidy. It has nothing to do with just the procurement, or just by increasing procurement, it does not even come into the budget documents. It comes in the budget documents when the procurement is stored and transported in the form of PDS, and it is the difference between the PDS price and the procurement cost, which is what comes in as the food subsidy, which again, if we look at the notes below, it's quite clearly written there. But because this is this is so, where do you know how much the government has spent on MSP? That is being done by the Food Corporation of India, which is not a department. It is an enterprise. And so you find those in the Food Corporation of India website. I'm giving this example also that because using this, we can also understand how this extra budgetary support works. So what was happening for these years between 2016 to 2021 was that the government, FCI was procuring grain, FCI was distributing grain, and FCI was telling government, this is the subsidy amount between procurement and distribution, which you have to pay us. Now, once the government pays that to FCI, it comes as food subsidy in your expenditure budget document. But if the government does not pay that to the FCI, it does not come as food subsidy in your expenditure budget. So what the government was doing was paying a part of it, like say, let's say 2016-17, about 1 lakh crores, the total food subsidy in effect was 1,80,000 crores, but the government paid FCI only 1,10,000 crores. So if you look at the budget documents, we will think that the food subsidy is 1,10,000 crores. The additional 70,000, it asked the FCI to borrow. And a big part of this was borrowed from the National Small Savings Funds, which is again the savings of common people. So each year on year, this is what happened, where therefore, if you looked at the food subsidy, it looks as if despite the National Food Security Act coming in, despite the number of ration cards increasing and the price going down, that the food subsidy has not increased at all. But that's not the full picture, because what was happening is that the FCI each year was borrowing these amounts of money. And then the COVID year was used as a year to clean up the accounts. So while it was praised that transparency was brought in, and it's a good thing that now we have that extra budgetary resources statement, it also was done at a time when the government could afford to do it. So if you look at this figure in the right, you see that up to 2015-16, this extra budgetary was not happening. Later, what the budgets showed was this darker line, right? This is what the budget document showed. But what was actually being spent was this orange line on top. But by showing this lower line, your total expenditure was smaller and your fiscal deficit was also lower. And then in the COVID year, when it was accepted by everybody that fiscal deficit could increase, was a year when suddenly all this loan repayment was brought in. So these 2 years, the loan repayment happened, and then it was adjusted. It's back again at this level. So this spike that we saw in the COVID year 2021 was not entirely to do with the free grain being given. A large portion of it was also paying back previous loan. And that data you can see in the FCI website, where they have a page on financing. If you just go down this page, you look at here, for example, details of NSSF loan provided to FCI. It's now only up to 18-19. Till 2 years back, this showed us older data. But you can clearly see, it tells you how much outstanding loan was there and how much was repaid. So you look at 2021, the COVID year, 3.3 lakh crores was actually what was repayment of NSS loans from previous years. So that was not actually an increase in food subsidy that year. But often what we see is, without looking at these things, it gets reported as how food subsidy is increasing so much and that it is unaffordable. Again, without going into that debate, even right at the beginning, the point is that it was a large part of it was actually making up this gap from the previous years. So it was not food subsidy of that year to begin with. And that is something year on year, the economic survey has been reporting. So this is a table from the economic survey where you will see, and this is from last year's, but if you look at economic survey of even say 2018 or 2017, it always has this figure on trend in food subsidy. And then it has the star in these years. If you go down and read the notes on why there is a star, it will say includes National Small Saving Fund loan. So here, if we look at the budget documents, these amounts don't match with the budget documents. They're higher. they're higher because the economic surveys included the loan amount. So again, this is how off-budget adjustments are made so that the overall budget looks clean, that it doesn't look as if the government is spending much more than it can afford. In reality, it's a bit of a jugglery to keep the markets happy while also doing things that you need to do, which is why, like I said in the beginning also, the budget is also a political statement. Of course, it is hard numbers, but you have to really take a magnifying lens to try and understand these numbers. Often governments are trying to also hide certain things. And because this is something that has to go through the parliamentary process, you cannot have a budget if the parliament has not approved it. This has to be transparent. But there are ways in which things are brought into it, where you make these adjustments, where it becomes very complicated to understand. So the best way, of course, to be more transparent is to put this all in public and to understand. And one doesn't expect every journalist or every even researcher to have an expertise in every sector to know what's going on. But broadly, one principle that one learns from this, even this food subsidy experience, is that one needs to try and triangulate the data as much as possible from multiple sources. That could be one way of knowing what is going on if you suspect that something is wrong. For example, because I work on PDS, when I saw these budget figures, one always wondered what was going on, because this is a period when PDS expanded. This is the period when number of ration cards increased, when more grain was being given. If you looked at the food grain bulletin, that showed that more grain was going out. But why was the budget not increasing? It is also a period when MSP is increasing. So what is going on? And then you look at, okay, let's see what the economic survey is saying. Then you find the stars. Then you say, okay, let's see how much loan is there, and you go to FCI. Then you find, okay, there is this loan going on. And that's how one is able to put together the story of what really is happening. And if one hadn't, then we were led to believe that in 2021, as a proportion of GDP, that the food subsidy went up so high that was unsustainable. But that was not all of it was that year. And one needs to really understand that, because these things then affect the programs also, because then you have the whole discourse around how they are unaffordable and it's so high and therefore it should be closed down. But if you look at the real figures, except for the one COVID year, it's been around 1% of GDP. So this also tells us why it's important to look at it as a percentage of GDP, because otherwise you can always say that, oh, in 2010, it was 63,000 crores and now it is 2 lakh crores. But as a proportion of the GDP, it was around 1% then. It continues to be around 1% even now. The economy is becoming richer. The government can afford to spend more as well. And the other caution in this is that the MSP itself is not a subsidy. So that's these things take time to bring out. It's not stuff that can happen on the same day as the budget. But that is where the extra budgetary, just in the case of FCI, but this is done in other heads as well. So some further, again, examples and things to keep in mind is to, because a lot of reporting, this is particularly from the point of view of immediate reporting also, is that a lot of things are reported just as they are said in the speech. And oftentimes the speech doesn't really match with what is there in the budget. What are the ways in which this could happen? One is that the allocations announced could be over multiple years. So for instance, the COVID year, there was an announcement of a new health program, Pradhan Mantri Suraksha, something, I don't remember the full name. It was over 60,000 crores. But when you went to the budget, you found that there was only 10,000 crores. Less than 10,000 crores actually allocated for that program. And then when you went to the press release on that scheme, it was found that that scheme was something that was supposed to be implemented over the next 6 years. But what it got was eyeballs that year, that there was this new scheme with 60,000 crores. And then nobody has bothered to check in the following budgets if that scheme continues, if the allocations for that are in line with what was promised in year one, and so on. The same thing with the National Nutrition Mission. which is now called Poshan, there was a big amount announced initially, over 9,000 crores. But then you went and checked that that was actually over 3 years. And then one also found out that that included a state contribution. So finally, if you look at what is it that the union government is saying that they will spend in the current year, many times it could be much less than what is actually said in the speech. And this is across governments. All the examples that I'm giving happens whether it is the present government or the previous government. But therefore, the speech, I mean, the budget documents are put up very soon after the speech is completed. At least the big headline figures should be checked on whether they are really reflecting in it. Another related thing is sometimes where definitions change. For example, the health budget. The COVID year, the year after COVID, a big headline was that 137% increase in health budget. And this 137% increase was again because things were included in the health budget which are not usually included. For example, this table, and one didn't have to search very far. This was there in the annexure to the speech, where normally when we talk about the health budget, we look at only these first three, which is the Department of Health and Family Welfare, Department of Health Research, and Ayush, which is directly what the Ministry of Health is spending, is the health budget. And we just saw the Department of Health and Family Welfare, which is the highest spender. There was not that much increase to say that there's a 137% increase. But what happened was that what the speech mentioned, and like I was saying, so it's not blatant lying that one is accusing governments of, that's not what they do, but they change definitions. And the truth is there somewhere if we dig deep enough. This was right there in the annexure to the speech, where the breakup for this 137% increase was given, where you saw that drinking water and sanitation, which is not normally included in the health budget, was included. This was the year the Jal Shakti mission was introduced. So there was a big increase in the budget for water sanitation. Not to say that spending on water sanitation is bad, but to say that, and these finance commission grants for water sanitation, which go directly to the panchayat, that these are not usually looked at as part of the health budget. But in a year, because they have increased because of other reasons, putting them in health and saying health has increased by 137% is not really correct. Because when we talk about goals such as 2.5% of GDP being spent on health, which is part of the goals of the national health policy, at that time, water and sanitation was not considered part of health. And that goal, therefore, does not include this. So if we are measuring up against promises made, against what's happening, it's not really correct to include this. So, but that 137% was headlines everywhere, whereas the speech itself said that much of the increase is also because certain items which were usually not included in the health budget got included. There's one item, the vaccination, which got included, which is a one-time expenditure, which again got included here. And all of this was put together and shown that so much was being done for health in COVID. Whereas here, where there are huge gaps in expenditure or in allocations, there was in fact no change at all. And in real terms, the actuals were even less than what was. So basically, need to, again, look at what is being done. Are there any changes in definitions before celebrating or criticizing any announcement? Another, again, is when new schemes are announced, to see if, firstly, if it is there in the budget. So if you trace the health insurance, which finally became the Ayushman Bharat Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, with different names, it kept getting announced for 3-4 years with no budget, or you will have 1,000 crores, but no scheme there. And then finally, it came with a new name with some budget, where it was again reported as, celebrated as the largest health insurance scheme in the world, without a pause to think about what is this scheme, what does health insurance mean, how much is allocated for it. Because if you look at the amounts, not very much was allotted for it. With that much allocation, how many people can be covered? You know, those kind of checking the numbers is something that is usually missing, and it can be done quite easily if you just look at what is said in the speech and open the expenditure budget of that ministry to see what is actually going on. On the receipt side as well, tax announcements, for instance, when we get these, you have the new tax regime and the old tax regime, and it will tell you that the deduction rate has level has gone up and so on. Once again, the tax rates, the changes that have happened, while they have to be passed along with the budget, they are not part of the budget. The budget is only giving you an estimate of the total receipts you expect from taxes. What are the rates? What are the fine? What is the fine line there? What are the details? It's something that you see in the finance bill. And like we just saw in the website, you have the finance bill here, which gives the details. But if one doesn't want to go into the finance bill, even this memorandum explaining the finance bill gives a summary of what is there. So this is where you actually get the tax rates and what is going on and what the exemptions are. So the speech will not give these details. The speech picks up some one number which is convenient. But what one really needs to do is then to look at these documents which are there uh, available to really see what the detail is and does it match up and how much does it match up. So while the speech gives you an indication of what the main priorities are, there are ways to verify them, and those need to be done. And the more time one has, the more detailed the verification can be as well. So along with verifying statements in the speech from the budget, verifying numbers in one part of the budget from other part of the budget. So for instance, you have the expenditure budget, then you have another document which is giving you the highlights of the budget, just comparing these two and seeing whether they're matching or not. If they're not, there would be something somewhere else, because finally all these numbers have to add up. It's about finding how they're making it add up, because it is an accounting statement at the end of the day. The books have to match. But how are they doing that? Is for that we'll have to look at different documents in the budget to try and find out what's happening. I've tried to give some examples of that. Another way of triangulating is also to look at other sources. Again, I understand, and Nitin, I'll just finish in a few minutes, and Nitin will discuss how journalists can use this. That there is a time crunch when journalists have to report, but at the same time, being familiar with certain other documents would help. For instance, the economic survey that comes out every year. The previous day, the appendix of the economic survey, again, it's all available on the internet. There are previous economic surveys available. All economic surveys have something called the statistical appendix, which is very useful because in Excel, they give you data for many years, right? So whatever you need, these are the things usually we get phone calls for as well. So from 1950-51, you have the GDP data that the economic survey is giving you. You can download it in Excel format as well. The food subsidy I just showed you. So in these statistical appendix and in the chapters for each ministry, the economic survey has a lot of data. And if we look at that and look at the budget figure, then certain things start making sense. Another very useful website, which is not used very much, is this CGA, the Controller General of Accounts, which does the audit, which tells you real time what is sort of going on. So this is the latest available. So as on end of November 23, it's telling you what the budget estimated by November 23, what was achieved, and what is it as a percentage. And last year, at the same time, what percentage was achieved. So again, this is very useful to see. For instance, there was a question also about last minute spending in certain departments. So if you look at the spending and you click on the details, you look at each ministry, what was allocated, and in the first 6 months, how much was spent. So you can see that in some cases, it will be very low, the spending, which will again tell you, like, look at Northeastern region, with all the who are only 11% of the budget that was allocated. So this is what the government said that they would spend. There was an intention to spend, but very little of that was spent. And you can see that the big gap is in capital. So maybe there were big projects planned for building roads or railways or something else which didn't take off. And you can see that here. Usually you see in the Ministry of Social Welfare, just Social justice always has a low spending. It is clearly, again, not a high priority program. It doesn't take off. Then towards the end of the year, they might see, okay, we need to utilize, otherwise next year we won't get an allocation. So some spending happens. And these are things that get then reflected in your revised estimates and the next year's budget also. So looking at these other websites, then you have the CAG reports, you have parliamentary standing committee reports, all the demand for grants. Demand for grants is what the ministries or the departments project as what they require. Then there's a discussion, then it gets approved, then it's put up as part of the final budget. Those are discussed by the parliamentary standing committees. The parliamentary standing committees make recommendations. There are action taken reports on that. All of those help to understand these numbers better. Departmental websites, for instance, the health ministry has something called the rural health statistics, which if we compare, so we see that it's being claimed that the health budget is more than doubled, but in those years, the number of health centers, the number of doctors, the number of sub-centers, the number of centers with water and electricity, that these have not changed at all. Then it'll click somewhere that something's wrong. Then where did the money go? So that question of where did the money go can come from looking at two things. It could be two different documents in the same budget. It could be looking at program data. It could be looking at CGA. It could be looking at economic survey. But if we just try to verify by looking at two different places, the same thing, many times we catch things that are hidden or they're trying to hide. And that does not take so much time. Of course, going into detail and then trying to find out which is closer to truth, what is happening, to do something like this takes more time, because then you have to really try and understand where things are hidden, and websites keep getting updated. So suddenly you lose older data which was there. There is all that issue. But still, the main thing of all these examples is that one, I mean, we can't take many of the things which are there at face value, but at the same time, there is a lot of information there, and the answers are also there in those same very documents. So just to conclude, and then I hope there is a discussion after Nitin speaks as well. The upcoming budget, although this is time just before the budget, the current budget, one doesn't expect very much to happen because, like I said, it's an interim budget. It is not supposed to include any, by rule, any big policy announcements. But we do know that the 2019 budget, for instance, was the interim budget was the one which announced the Kisan Samman Nidhi, the 6,000 rupees to farmers, where it was announced with retrospective effect. So the first, it said that that would be from December 2018, so that the first installment could actually be given before the election itself. So although major announcements should not be part of this, they are sometimes, and we did see that in the previous budget. From the news reports itself, we know that what is being expected this time also is probably an increase in the amount of the Kisan Samman Nidhi. So in that, what would one do is to immediately go to the budget of the Ministry of Agriculture. And if they say that from 6,000, it is being made 12,000, the first thing to check would be to see, has the whole budget also doubled? If it hasn't, but the individual entitlement has doubled, then are the number of farmers to be targeted reducing? There's something wrong. It's just direct math again, that if people getting 6 are going to get 12, then the total overall budget should increase from 72,000 or whatever it is to 144. It has to be doubled. Another announcement that's being expected is that the health insurance amount would increase to 10 lakhs. And that's not something that's easy to see in the budget, because it's an insurance. What the government pays is the premium, or in some cases there's a trust fund, but that's something that after the thing happens. But here it would be to read up on what does the scheme mean? Is health insurance the best way to go? Is it really, is the problem really that people are spending, that the 5 lakhs, which is currently the amount, is not enough? How many families are even spending the 5 lakhs that it needs to be increased to 10 lakhs? These are the kind of questions already one knows. One should anticipate and look up, because the newspapers are saying this is where probably a change will come. That's the other kind of preparation and homework that we can do over the next 1 week, less than a week before the budget is presented, to be able to do some of the things that I mentioned here. So I'll stop here and hand over to Nitin. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Deepa. That was such a wide sweep over document. But to friends, I've been a journalist who's attempted at times to understand the budget, have had the opportunity to write. And I must tell you, if any one of you is trying this for the first time to understand, don't get deterred by the volume of data that you have to go through. And don't get deterred by becoming expert overnight. I can promise you, having been an insider, most business papers will get it wrong on the first day. Most editorial comments that come on the first day is full of faff. Most of them have also gone through what the government has just put out, really not going through details. There'll be exceptions who would understand the budget even after 30 years of having just done the budget every year. And there'll be an exception to that subset who would actually tell the truth on the first day. The typical trick in business papers, if you read, is to put out anything critical on the second or the third day, so the government does not get pissed off enough that you on the first day ruined their happiness. So you'll find everyone saying, "Oh, the budget is brilliant," or you'll find them saying, "Well, the budget is balanced under the circumstances." So this is not where I think Deepa's opened up the field. It's just about getting familiar with those numbers and start with the smaller things. Pick up, say, if you are interested in a particular subject, you cover environment, health, women issues, nutrition. Just look at that subset to begin with this year and say, can I understand this better? Can I find the numbers for myself, even if somebody else is talking of those numbers? At least that's how I began. To just verify the second day to say, when the paper said this much number, can I find it in these documents? There are other larger concepts that Deepa discussed, and there's some questions, Deepa, that not some, but many questions that came your way. We'd shared them with you. I thought we could run over some of them and some ideas that I thought if we could spend more time discussing. One of them, and you touched upon it, is this business of fiscal deficit. We always hear these economic writers saying that, oh, fiscal deficit is so high, it will cause us a lot of problems. Government should retain it within this limit. And then you told about the tricks in which the government tries to, on the paper at least, show that it's very healthy. But I remember you discussing saying sometimes the fiscal deficit number needs to be read in a certain context. Is there a good fiscal deficit and a bad fiscal deficit? Is there a range? And how do we, so give us an example or two to understand what fiscal deficit really means, what are its implications for us and the economy, and how should we think about it more than just read the number? Deepa.
Yeah. With the caution that now I'm simplifying things like the government does, and so somebody who doesn't agree with me can say that I'm manipulating things. But because it is, I'll try and put it simply. Fiscal deficit is like in a household budget. You earn an income and you spend. The difference between the two is what the deficit is. But the difference between a household budget and a government budget is that the sources that the government has to meet the deficit are very different. I mean, beginning from the fact that the government can even just print money to meet their deficit, which is something that households cannot do. And the deficit, when a government has a deficit or when the government is spending, it has what is called a multiplier effect, right? Which is the old Keynesian thing about when there is unemployment in an economy, from a Keynesian point of view, that say production is not happening because there is no demand, right? To give an example, during COVID, a lot of the COVID relief measures that were announced was to cheapen credit. There were these interest subventions and so on, despite which investment did not increase as much as was expected. Why did that not happen? One understanding is that because even if credit is available, an investor, say a capitalist, would not be willing to invest if that person does not see profits coming from it. And if you have unutilized capacity and if there's low demand, you would not. So, for example, if the credit is there for you to buy another machine in where you're making, let's say, t-shirts, but the machines that you already have a capacity of producing 10,000 t-shirts in a month, but you're able to sell only 8,000 because there is no purchasing power, that there is no effective demand for your 10,000 t-shirts. You might give them credit for even 1% or even free loan. They don't want it because they're not able to use the existing machine at all. In that kind of a situation where there is a demand deficit in the economy. And that's something that we've been seeing in India the last few years. When you look at figures of, say, two-wheeler sales going down or Parle-G biscuits not being consumed and so on. When there is a demand, government spending plays a role of boosting this demand in various ways. And that creates actually productive capacity and increases the income. So that's a situation where even going in a deficit might be something that is all right. In fact, recommended for governments to do. So there is no one magic number, although the FRBM tries to give a magic number. A better way to do it probably is to compare it with similar economies, which others have tried to do. The IMF gives the data of you look at other countries in other low middle income countries. And when they are facing, say, COVID was a great thing because there was a decline in growth across the world. What did the governments do? But usually when the business cycle is down, when growth is down, that's when governments should be spending more to revive the economy. And in fact, the Indian government has been doing that and saying it also. The increase in capital expenditure to 10 lakh crores was part of this, that if the government invests, so it's the simple multiplier mechanism of government is building roads. When it's building roads, it's buying cement, it's employing people. The cement manufacturer is getting some money. The people being employed are getting some money. They are demanding, maybe the people are demanding buckets and toothpaste and biscuit and whatever. That makes the bucket and toothpaste and the t-shirt factory produce more. And that creates ultimately more output than the initial 10 lakh crores that the government spent. Other than, of course, then the roads would also bring in other things because it's building infrastructure. So overall, spending is something that governments do when there is unemployment or when there's a recession to revive the economy. And at that time, tightening purses could actually have a ulta reverse effect, because then the demand, if there is no purchasing power, if there is no demand, then finally the private sector produces for profits. If there's nobody who has the purchasing power, then they will not produce. So if that is not happening, how do you break it? You need an external stimulus, and the government does it. So this recent NK Singh committee, Rangarajan has also been saying that you can't have a fixed number, that it has to be somewhere pegged to what is happening to the economy as well, by looking at how growth is happening. So when growth is slowing down, it's a time when government should be spending. That's the simple sort of principle. But the flip side of this is the stock market, which is not part of the GDP, but which indirectly affects all our lives and which governments are very sensitive to. Whatever the state of the economy is, the stock market usually reacts badly to the fiscal deficit, because that's entirely based on expectations. And this is one of the headline figures that goes into, are things going right or wrong? And the political economy behind that is fiscal deficit is seen to increase inflation, which reduces your expected returns and so on. But without going into that, so what you put out as your fiscal deficit number kind of influences the way people who are speculating in the stock market think about what is going to happen. And just because that's how it functions, it affects the market. So it's a fine balance that governments are also trying to sort of maintain. But currently where we are, we should be spending, is my opinion. And it's not at all bad for the fiscal deficit to increase. And many countries had a higher deficit in the COVID years than we did.
Right. Thanks. I think, Deepa, many of our colleagues who've joined are from different states, and I've seen this question pop up repeatedly is, can we, from the union government's budget, figure out how much the states are getting? Is it there? Is it not? And if it's not, like, just explain how much can we track down about what's coming to states?
All you can track down is the share of taxes that the states are getting. Right? So state get through the Finance Commission grants of the taxes that, which was part of this report, on how much most of the taxes are collected by the center. You have the GST and the direct income tax, all that goes to the center, right? And then the center has a Finance Commission gives you the formula for how that is shared. So what the budget gives you is how much. So it gave you the total revenue, and then that statement gives you the transfer to the states. The detailed statement also gives an Excel with what each state is getting. But the states also get funds, all these other expenditures through the central sector schemes and the central sponsored schemes also go through state budgets. There, the budget document doesn't tell us which state is getting how much. But what the budget document also doesn't tell us is that most of these schemes also require the states to contribute a matching amount. And they have different ratios for different schemes. So ICDS will say 60-40. So 60% is given by Government of India, which will go into the state budget. 40% has to be added by the state, and then that gets spent. There are some schemes where Government of India says they will not give the 60 unless the state gives the 40. There's some schemes where they'll directly give the 60 and say recommend that they add on 40. So those details you don't get in the budget. You'll have to look at the state budgets for it. Usually state budgets also happen in this period between late February. By April 1st, most of the states have it. But state budgets are even more difficult. They're not so well organized in terms of their websites and looking at things. But any particular sector, like say health, for instance, is a state subject. So most of the spending in health actually happens by state governments. The amounts that we see in the central government is only about 20% of the spending in health. For those, one will have to go into state. It's not immediate. Just last point, the RBI consolidates information from state budgets, but that's not so immediate. So now you'll get the last year's. So there you will get some information.
Right.
It's called RBI State Finances, and there they give you a buy heads and so on.
Right. There's a question from Ms. Anisha Sheth who says, what is grants in aid that you see in these budget documents?
It's just a grant. And in simple terms, that it is a grant that is being given without expecting any return. If you look at again that key to budget documents, it has the definition there.
Right. There's a question from Mr. Balaji. Yes, he says, I'll take one of the two questions he's asked. He's saying, has there been a significant improvement in the budgeting process by changing the budget date from March 1st to February 1st? In your view?
I don't know, difficult to say. I mean, it's coming earlier, but the process, how do you evaluate a process? I mean, one of the ways to evaluate it would be, has it become more participatory? Has it become more transparent? I don't think so, although the time is there. What it has maybe done is that now states and these programs have some time. They know from April what's going on a little early, but I don't see a big difference, at least in the schemes and programs that I follow. This change in timing having made to how those actually function. Because all of them also have a process. You know, a lot of things other than new schemes are quite routine. They are quite expected also. Like say midday meal goes through a whole process of an annual program implementation plan. Every state first sends how many children they have, how much they eat and so on. And then, so they make a demand. And they have these meetings where they see the response of the ministry. So there is a sense of what is going to come. There'll be some big ticket items which might be surprises, but a lot of things for the implementers, they kind of know.
So I had one question, Deepa, which I've never figured out for myself after years, is very often some economists will tell us that the union government's hands are quite tied literally in how much they can spend instead on A on Y because they have too much spending locked up. Too much of commitments are already blocked and they really can't shift it. What are these commitments that the government can't alter, therefore its budget is limited, if this is the case?
I was saying there's certain things which are routine, which is a huge proportion of the budget, right? Like you have your health centers, you have your schools, you have your universities, you have the basic salaries at the current level that have to be paid, the basic day-to-day running expenditure that has to be made. There are entitlements that have been defined under various acts, or even sometimes, for instance, for this time, you have already announced that free grains will continue for another 5 years. So when they're sitting with the numbers, that's the first thing you would lock in, because that has to be done. And given the politics of it, you can't just not increase the MSP. So if the MSP is increasing, this is free, then the food subsidy will increase every year. So there are things, commitments that have already been made. There are routine functions, institutions that the government runs, which have to run, which have to continue. So it's only after that that there is space, given you have your estimates of what your revenue is going to be, which is based on how buoyant your economy is. And you have put to yourself a limit on what your fiscal deficit can be. So once you put all those into the equation, then there is that little bit. that you can play around with. But what happens in that is that the weakest usually lose out. So when you have some big announcement, new expenditure, where do the cuts happen is what we should look at also. So for example, the National Old Age Pension Scheme has been 200 rupees per person now for 15 years, I think. So there, nobody is locked up, committed, nothing, because that's a faltu thing. Or you'll have some scholarship scheme for some children. These things slowly vanish also. Creche scheme, for instance. Our creche is now in single digit crores, the budget, the daycare services. So there's some things where they think political we can be closed down is where the adjustments are made.
Okay. A connected question that came in when people were registering was the challenges before us with the debt to GDP ratio moving up higher. I guess what somebody was referring to is if your debt levels of the government are high, why is the government getting locked up with that? What's the challenge of that? And is that really happening? Is the debt to GDP ratio higher now than before?
So the debt to GDP is to do with the fiscal deficit. So it goes up and down. It's actually now much lower than, like, I mean, that was one of the crises of the 91 when reforms happened and so on. So again, governments are in debt across the world. You rarely have governments which are in surplus, and it's fine for governments to be in debt. There are 2-3 things here. One is, of course, the level, and also what is it being used for is another way in which it is looked at. So if it's something that is going to give you higher returns than the cost of debt, then that's fine. Most companies also run on debt. They don't make profits immediately. And governments can be on debt for the long term also, that's fine. It's about where it is getting spent is more important, which is why that difference between the revenue deficit and the fiscal deficit is also made. Because broadly, the understanding is that a revenue deficit does not give you returns, whereas the fiscal minus revenue is your capital expenditure, which will give you higher returns, and you can repay higher than the interest you're paying on the debt. As long as broadly, putting it in simple terms, the returns are higher than the interest you're paying on the debt, it should not be a problem.
Right. Again, a connected question, but more looking for specific places to find data. Mr. Akshay Tarfe is asking specifically about loans given by development banks to states and union governments. Where can we locate these? How much loans the union or the state government has got? What is the principal paid? How much interest it's paying? In the budget document, or is there any other place that possibly these numbers could be dug out?
You do get headline numbers in the so if you look at the receipt budget, in the asset and liability, this external assistance will give you the broad numbers of the loans.
But this is only for the union government, right?
It's only for the union government, yeah. But then even this is just very broad. Then there are 2 places where you can kind of follow up is to go to the World Bank website, for instance, which will have details of the loans. And there is even that will tell you, because even what they give to state governments is there in the World Bank, and state government also has to go through, I mean, it goes through RBI and you have to take permission. It's not like states don't have as much freedom as the central government has to take to borrow. But yeah, the budget documents give you the broad what comes into the union budget.
Okay, Mr. Prasanna Joshi, I think you covered it, but in case you want to go over it again, where to find specific scheme-related expenses data is the expenditure budget, but if maybe you want to show it once again to somebody, some people might have.
So if you go to the expenditure budget, and if you know what scheme you're looking for, let's say you want to look at the midday meal. So if I go to Department of School Education, midday meal is now called Poshan, this Pradhan Mantri Poshan Shakti Nirman, this line. Know that what was allocated was 11,600 crores. revised was 12,800. This only tells me this. And here you can see what I was talking about, that it was earlier called National Program on Midday Meal. So that's in this line in 21-22. Then from 22-23, you see that there's no data here, but it's here. So we need to know that PM Poshan Shakti Nirman is the same as midday meal. So these are actually fully comparable. Then you look at this figure. Then you have to go to the midday meal. Like if you want further on, sorry. So this is the midday meal, the Poshan Shakti website, which will then tell you, there is a lot of information here, which will tell you the coverage and how much was spent on cooking cost and so on. Further, if you want even more detail, you go to these program approval board meetings, you go to that year, every state you will get detailed district wise, how many children are covered and so on. So each program you'll have to, for the program data, go to the program's website. Midday Meal is one of the better maintained websites. Some of it you'll have to search. Another source which is very good to look for these kind of beneficiary and other data is parliamentary questions actually.
Two questions from people who had registered and sent their questions in. The first one is, if there is a huge mismatch between the budgeted numbers, the revised estimates, does it show something is really wrong? Is it a cover up, or what is happening with those numbers changing? Like, can it reflect different things? And if that's the case, what all should we see between the numbers?
See, it depends on how it's changing. So if it is reducing, then we'll have to look at what that program is. Is it because they're shifting that money somewhere else? Or is it one of those programs where I think somebody said it in this, or it was in the questions that came online. Some programs, the spending happens right at the end because it's also low priority. It's not very efficient. The governance is poor. So it'll be very slow and suddenly the last 2 months they will spend. So we have to really look at it program by program. Sometimes expenditure even increases. For example, in the 15-16 budget, like it was reported after the Finance Commission grants to states increased, where they cut it was the WCD budget was reduced by half. So when you saw the BE of 15-16, that is 50% of what it was of the previous year of 14-15. But there was also a lot of protest. Menaka Gandhi was the Women and Child Development Minister at that time. So there were a lot of, civil society groups, child rights groups, which protested saying, how can you cut this by half? Because this is the only program that exists for children under 6. Delegations met Menaka Gandhi. She then released a statement saying this is unfair, we can't function and so on. Then it was actually by the revised budget, it increased by a huge amount. So, but it was an increase where they brought it back because this was a cut they made thinking this would happen quietly and it did not happen and it had. So each one will have a different story. First is to look whether there's a difference, and if there is, then it's a different investigation to see why there is.
Again, a question that somebody had sent earlier to us. Can we see in the budgets allocations being made particularly for tribal communities and Dalit communities? Is it something segregated that one can see, and how real are they? How sensible are they to read into?
Yeah, I'll try and share those also. So again, in the expenditure budget, if you go to the expenditure profile, you have these allocation for welfare of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So this again, like the gender budget, has both types. You have these generic programs in which they give you an estimate on how much is for SC, ST. And you also have the direct, like
Schemes which are directly for certain communities or segments of society.
Like say even the midday meal is here. And they're taking a percentage of the midday meal budget and saying that is going to Dalit children. So therefore they're putting it over here. but they would also be, say, welfare hostels for Dalits. That will also come here. But there is this different statement which gives you that detail. So all these scholarships for SCs, all this will come here. It will also come in the Department of Social Justice budget. But this puts together from across ministries and departments what can be shown as being allocated for SCST. And then you look at the total and you can do a percentage with the total expenditure also.
Right. There was a question, more generic, at saying, are there more Deepas in the country? In other words, are there other organizations and individuals who go through similar assessment of the budget and put it out elsewhere? If you have names you would want to suggest for journalists to track or websites to look at.
Yeah, much better Deepas in the country, actually. Like I said, this is not I do it only around this time for the areas I'm interested in, but two organizations that I named, which have a lot of resources. One is Accountability Initiative, which is hosted in CPR. And they do these actually around this time, they usually bring out these budget briefs. So they already look at the last many years and also triangulate with the number of beneficiaries and that sort of thing. And then post-budget, again, they give a response. There is also the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, CBGA, which 2-3 days after the budget puts out a comprehensive report which looks at both revenue and expenditure. And all the previous reports are available online. Both these organizations also have resources on how to understand budgets. They have some primers, this kind of difference between revenue and capital and so on. Again, every year things keep changing. Their resources might be a few years old, but the broad things remain the same. Beyond that, it is really, I mean, these are the organizations which are really doing budget work, and there are many also regional organizations that are looking at state budgets as well. And they're part of a network. It's called Open Budget Initiative, which also has a website which is trying to put out state budgets online. But just to add to that after a point, if you're looking at any particular, after the immediate response, if you're looking at going deeper down into understanding a sector or a program, then you have to be able to match the budget with an understanding of the program as well. The budget has its limitations, it adds to that. So that then you would look for experts in that domain rather than a budget expert. So if you're working on SCST allocations, then one should find out what, say, the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights feels about it, because they have been tracking, and then triangulate that with the numbers in the budget.
I mean, I would pick it up from that for even us as journalists. All of us do have some areas that we want to focus on or do focus on. It's good to keep track on those numbers through and through years, because you start seeing patterns that otherwise will not be visible. So do this exercise even after the budget is over, even if you're not writing immediately on the budget, just pick up those numbers, because they help you understand the long trends of how governance is changing on those areas. To Mr. Subramaniam was also asking me, why do you think mainstream organizations do not educate reporters to avoid errors and misrepresentation? I think one, many of us actually don't know while we pretend to know. Two, the nature of the profession is such that we are all very cagey about sharing knowledge and information. The reporters collective is a little different because it is a collective, and our mandate is to share as much as we do ourselves is to share with others. But again, I think all of us who have learned these things have learned from people within the profession as well as experts like Deepa. I think there are many other people if we reach out to in time, not on the last day and the day after the budget, but if you reach long enough to say, hey, just tell me for an hour, what do you think, how to read the document? There are many professionals, experts who still speak to us, share very gratuitously, something we don't do within our profession. So it's just what the nature is. I think it's our inability also to reach out to the right experts early enough. Most of us are caught in this daily routine of saying catching up with an expert 10 minutes before we need to put the story out. The experts are also then aware that all you need is a quote or all you need is one sentence, and they will also not spend time with you. It's better to come early to them, check with them. Then they would even write back with documents. This is how I've learned from Deepa. If you reached out long enough early before the budget, she would send you numbers to look at. She'll give you an understanding in which you can read those numbers. But that's true for all journalism, I think, and in all contexts. Deepa, if you're okay, we'll take. I did lots of questions, but I felt you covered a lot of the ground of the questions that was asked. If you saw any that you want to respond to specifically, or I had one in mind before we close the session.
Just one, I thought, I don't have a response, but I thought it should come out as this Mansi's question on our parliament spending enough time scrutinizing the budget. I think that's also important to look at. It's now, I guess it always was, but even more, it's a given. So the whole idea is that the budget is presented, it's debated, and you can actually even make some changes, and then the finance bill is passed. But it's nothing much really happens. We know how the parliament is functioning, but I think that's has to be part of the discussion about how the transparency is so important, and the constitution recognizes that this is a process that has to go through the parliament. It is not the prerogative of the government to make budgets on their own. Everything that is spent from the Consolidated Fund of India has to go through the parliament. So I think MPs also probably need training, but this is something that they should be scrutinizing much more. The parliamentary standing committees, I think, are varying. Yes, some of them don't seem to know, but sometimes there are hidden gems in there. The kind of questions they ask and what comes out. But then what happens to those reports, we don't know. They're there, but they don't get taken seriously. But maybe that's why we need to look at them also, because right now nobody is looking at those reports. So
yeah, it's fascinating. I think I speak on behalf of my colleagues at the Reporters Collective and many others I know who will run through these parliamentary standing committee reports, look at those gems, and then file RTI based on that to get information which was just sitting plump for us to capture.
exactly, there is a lot there that.
Yeah. So I would encourage all journalists, do look at these parliamentary standing committee reports whenever the sessions of the parliaments are there, new reports are presented. Do scan through them. They look horrendously boring, but almost always it has some gem hidden for you to turn into stories. I'll take one last question, which is more generic, but it's been a economic political debate for a while, Deepa. One of our colleagues asked, what do you make sense of this freebies? What is freebies? What is welfare? I know there's a lot you can go over it, but give us a sense of how do we as journalists think about it? Forget right. What's the 2 or 3 sides of this debate that we should think about to have some moral judgment on these calls?
It could be a whole session. So again, I have a strong opinion. So I'll just tell you what I think about it. And the first, I think, which we might find it difficult to accept, I think it is the prerogative of a democratically elected government through this process of budgeting to spend the money, that the revenue that they've collected. And that's what the role of the parliament is supposed to be, that they debate it and they say, okay, this is faltu spending, don't do it, do something else. That process is not happening, but that is the inbuilt sort of mechanism. And also those who are voting should have an opinion on what is appropriate spending and not, because that is one of the main functions that the government is doing. But being an economist from that point of view of how should government spend their money, I think we do confuse. There are certain expenditures which you might not see immediate financial returns, which are critical and which only governments can do because markets fail in doing them across the world. And the most easy to understand examples are health and education. Right? Any mainstream Keynesian, heterodox Marxist economists will tell you, any color economist, that markets fail in providing healthcare services efficiently and equitably. Markets fail in providing education services efficiently and equitably. And so the state has to step in. It's also been shown that state only regulating, like say in the telecom market, is not enough for these things, because they have to, let's take immunization, for instance. There is a social gain from everybody being immunized, even though many might not be able to afford it. A poor person having a COVID vaccine is good for me, even if that poor person is not spending for it and the money is going from my tax, right? Because my protection from COVID depends on everybody being immunized. We have so many other things. This is a very direct sort of example. So the states have to spend. these cannot be considered freebies. So, and of course, there is a rights and moral argument also. Somebody in this day and age in a democracy should not be dying of a disease for which there is treatment available here in this country. Or somebody should not be dying of malaria or tuberculosis. Why do people die of these diseases? Because they are not well nourished. Even, I mean, it's the same bacteria that's giving TB in the same air that all of us breathe. Why are some people getting it and dying of it? Because of other kind of deprivation, and the state has a responsibility towards fulfilling these, and these don't come cheap. I think that is something that we find difficult to digest, that if teachers, nurses, childcare workers, food for children, all of this costs, and just because they are poor, you can't get away with giving poor quality, right? So for some basic amount. So if the ICDS or the midday meal budget increases, currently it is something like 8 rupees per child per day. So imagine what is the food you can give there. And doubling that, even with a fiscal deficit, is something that I would not call a freebie for sure. It is the right of the child, and finally the government is doing its responsibility. The second thing here is also that when we talk about freebies, you have to look at both sides of the budget. The loan waivers, not for the farmers, but big corporates, the kind of tax exemptions, so many things that are given are also freebies, but they're freebies for a different class who are seen to be productive. Why? I mean, they are supposed to be paying this tax. There is no evidence even there to show that by giving those tax exemptions, employment has increased. Employment is not being created. One can go on about this, but that definition of freebies, there is no single definition. There is no economic definition. There's certain things, of course, I would also think that money would, because there is ultimately limited money. And if I was the minister and I had to choose between investing in a comprehensive public health system vis-a-vis giving a cash transfer of 5,000 rupees a month, I would prefer to do the investing in the public health system. But that also, then I know that won't give me the votes. So that is the balance that the politician has to make. And it is sad that our politics is going in a certain direction, but I think it is no single party or no single government in one round can correct this either. So one has to understand the political economy before just dissing a freebie or not. And sometimes you can afford to do what you would even call freebies. Like if Tamil Nadu gave those mixer grinders and color TVs, it didn't hurt them very much. I mean, it hurt the sentiments of upper middle class people like us, but it didn't hurt the state finances. They didn't collapse because they gave color TVs. They also did health and education. They gave color TV also. Okay. People voted them in for that.
I think one thing you said thrice, and we must reiterate, this is, while it's the union government presenting the budget, this is our money. This is money of the citizens, where the government only holds the responsibility of spending it well on us. So when we hold the government responsible, we're basically saying, how is our money being spent on us? Are they doing their job well that we elected them to do for us? Unfortunately, in the last few years, this tone of governments having given us some benefits as if it's their money to hand over to us, or they're collecting it from sky and depositing it in our accounts. I think that notion needs to be undone in the way we write. Very often, I think for journalists, that tone of how you write, did some government find some largesse of heart to give it to us, or was this our right to get health and education and some government is actually delivering something on it, is essential. And this comes out of just the use of language, even if it's not numbers very often. I'll also request, some of you have seen our work, but you can go to our website, www.reporters-collective.in, take a look. Because this is open sessions and we only survive of donations from citizens and other friends who donate for our work. If you can donate, please do donate. If you can't, just give us a shout out on social media for this workshop, particularly thanking Deepa if you liked it. The recording of this session we will put out in a day or so. I think let's sleep on Sunday and we'll put it out by Monday evening or Tuesday morning for everyone to have. If you have suggestions of what other workshops would help you of different kinds, we will try and facilitate, bring experts to you to do this more often. Also, in this workshop, if you felt something could be done better, please do write in. We'll share it with Deepa. You have our email from the registration, and we'll convey it to her. It will help all of us. But I think on almost everyone's behalf, Deepa, I can thank you for the amount of effort you put in to explain rudimentaries. It's almost like you're taking us through a semester of education in 2 hours. So I know it's tough, and you packed a lot in that session. But I think all of us are grateful for this. Thank you so much. And we are closing on time perfectly well. Thank you, everyone, for being here.